I do actually want to acknowledge, I was actually really lucky when it came to doing this presentation because it gave me a chance to reflect on the great sessional teams that I've worked with. And it also helped me reflect a little bit on what my teaching philosophy is and how that's had to be adapted to deal with, the online environment we moved into. And I want to actually just ground this discussion a little bit in that background because I think it's important context for what I'm going to say later on. So basically my philosophy is it's around our job is to facilitate the application of knowledge and thereby help students to learn that way rather than just pass on knowledge. So I ask a lot of my tutors when it comes to them to contextualize, to facilitate, to question, to probe. And then the question really became is, how do we make this great stone soup by getting students to bring in their knowledge, their experiences to the learning environment? And how do we do that in an online environment? And how do I empower and enable my tutors to adapt their teaching approaches to still draw on the strengths they have and utilize that to deliver the learning outcomes that we have always been after. And so again, I want to really, really do acknowledge how I've learned a lot in this process from my tutors. So this presentation is much about them as it is about me. So where we started in this process back in February was we actually did, weirdly enough, as academics, we did a reflection on evidence-based practice. And what do we actually know that how it's different in a virtual environment and what we can actually apply from that. So some of the theories and some of the evidence that we teach to students that we've actually drawn upon is things such as job demand resource model. We know that people can deal with increased demands if we actually give them also increased resources. So that was really in the back of my mind is how can I actually give more support to my staff to give them back a sense of control and a sense of competency in this environment. And then also, of course, a big feature was on how do we adapt our group team process to function in this virtual environment. So, and again, like I said, I was blessed. Our team really went, rather than cursing the bad hand that we've been dealt, they all really focused on what can we do? How can we make this better? What candles can we light to improve the hand that we've been dealt? Sorry for mixing too many metaphors there, but that's what I often do. So the first thing I was really trying to do is how can I increase their self-perceptions of control and competency? I wanted to take away the uncertainty and wanted to provide them with the self-belief that they can work in this process. No, Ingrid, I'm going to keep it this way. Sorry, it doesn't easy to navigate for me. Sorry. Because the split screen, it moves to 2 screens, and then I'm getting a whole range of nightmare. So with this, what I focused on was there's 4 key questions for me around major change that I wanted to focus on. So why the change is occurring and what the change was, I think was pretty evident because of the COVID-19 and the large. But the questions my tutors had was more around how will my job change? What does it actually mean for me on a much more local level? And then they're asking me, how will you help me be effective in this, this brave new world? So when it came to all the trainings I did and all the meetings, they were really the 2 things I was focusing on. And that was really trying to actually manage, like I said, the perceptions of competency and competence and self-efficacy of my team. To give an example of what that looks like is Gareth and his team ran those fantastic Zoom sessions and how to utilize Zoom. They were a great introduction around what is going to be different. Post those trainings, I met with my team using social distancing, and we ran some hands-on practice to see what it actually looks like when they started teaching and what were some of the things that were a bit rough and a bit icky. And then we talked about how do we adapt and adopt our teaching styles and learning tasks to still function in that environment. So a really important part in that process was we're identifying individual and joint support needs. And through that, we redesigned as a team what the learning tasks were and how we were going to actually implement that. And that's an ongoing process. For an example, initially what we tried doing was running online tutorials where the tutors actually do their own tutorials, recorded them and put them up. And then we found out the time invested in that was just being too great. So what I did instead was I recorded a little 10-minute tutorial with activities, and then when we used the online tutorials, the tutors would then debrief and facilitate the discussion around that. So I did more of the heavy lifting around task design, online recording, and they did much more work on the process of how do we deliver learning outcomes or the learning objectives of this task. And I think that was, freeing them up to focus more on the process, and me as unit coordinator doing my job around giving them the material they required. Another little example was how can we get some real-time help if we need it. So we just created something very simple like a WhatsApp group. So if something goes down or there's, there's something happening in the tutorial, they can very quickly get support from another tutor, a peer, or myself. But the key for me here is they're little things that we did, but it was all about getting their involvement, helping them identify their own needs, and then that individualized consideration around how can I make them more effective as we go through. What is happening? The other discussion we had was then around how do we communicate? How do we use technology effectively? There are so many options. There are so many things out there we could be doing. How do we actually do this to be, to maximize and optimize what we do? And we had, again, nothing as practical as a good theory. We drew on media synchronicity theory, which talks about conveyance and convergence. So conveyance is when you need to transmit large information that's detailed, that's dense, and the person has to be able to process and think about it and work through it. So you're conveying stuff to somebody. Asynchronous. So we're using Dropbox, we're using email, anything that can be basically reprocessed and basically re-examined. What was probably the harder one was then around convergence. So convergence is any task where you need to really clarify, debate, adjust, and negotiate. And I think the one thing that's increased is the need for convergence. I think we're spending a lot more time now talking about getting more clarity around what we're trying to do, how we're trying to do it, have you thought about this, have you thought about that? And that requires a much more synchronous kind of back and forth. So going online, I thought we'd do a lot more around conveyance, a lot more asynchronous. In effect, what we've done more of as a team now is that convergence, where we have more regular Zoom meetings, where we have a more regular back and forth, just to get a shared understanding and to clarify how we're adapting what we're doing. And I think that's really, really crucial when it comes to getting consistency and the delivery of the unit, and delivery of the learning objectives across multiple tutors. I think trying to formalize and standardize stuff is actually counterproductive in this way. It's more about getting a shared understanding, having a shared teaching philosophy, and then basically empowering and enabling the tutors to draw upon their personal strengths in delivering that. So again, I am lucky in that regard. I have very involved, very engaged tutors who aren't shy in pushing back and giving me guidance. The one thing I have looked at that is probably the hardest thing to do right now for me is develop and maintain an awareness of what's happening in my teams, in my tutorial teams. I can't do the regular coffee catch-ups anymore that we used to do. So now I'm trying to find other ways to build an awareness around what's happening. And that's, there's four types of awareness I often think about is, firstly, what's the activities they're engaging in? What are the things they're currently working on? What are the things they're currently trying to do? And how can I support what they're doing on that front? Then it's their availability in terms of, what's happening in their personal lives. Do they have children? Do they have elderly parents who are being impacted? Do they have a sick partner? So, if they don't respond as quickly as they usually do, is that because what's going on around that? And again, it's providing that social emotional support. And it's, that's very hard to get if you don't have the one-on-ones or the coffee catch-ups where you can see the non-verbals. So again, really focusing on trying to build in opportunities for social engagement and discussions with my team. So we do go from a place where we start with the social, go to the procedural stuff, and finish with the task focus on the weekly activities. And another thing, of course, is the process focus around what are we doing, how we're doing it. And then the last one, which builds into the availability, but it's also that social awareness around what is happening outside. And the availability one, let's go back with, it's about, you know, their emotional availability, their cognitive availability, and the physical ability to be fully there, you know, in the classroom, especially in these strange times. Some of the things which can help with that, that we found to be useful, is trying to build a really predictable communication pattern. But, you know, we have meetings at this time, we send out to the instructions for this week at this point in time, we then have a discussion at this time, and then we actually meet back again to verify what's going on. And the responses I try to give are substantial and timely. And for those who know me, that timely part is a challenge, but I'm trying my best around that part of things. And the last thing I think is really important to try to have some pattern of stability around having a repeated temporal pattern of exchange that builds basically some level of structure, in these uncertain times. And so far, so good in those things for at least my teams. Now, does it work? I just want to share one really good news story at this time. This is a little love heart, a Zoom love heart, which I'm told is very hard to execute, from one of our student groups in one of our units. And again, the feedback was the students appreciate the extra effort that our tutoring staff are going above and beyond in delivering great learning outcomes. So again, I think that's fantastic for me when I see these kind of learning outcomes from the students. And again, credit here goes to the great sessionals that work with me. One last point before we finish. Again, the spirit of generosity that we've engaged in keeps coming back. So for the last close to a decade now, I've had students in one of my units develop fact sheets on how to work effectively in virtual teams. That was prior to them actually working in virtual teams. So they did basically a best practice or better practice guides for how can we be effective in virtual teams. I reached out to my past cohorts, and a lot of my students have said, yep, by all means, feel free to share our work with others so they can benefit from our learnings. So I'm working with Gareth's team to see how we can actually make those fact sheets and those tip sheets on how to work well in virtual teams available to a wider audience. But again, if you access that, please pay it forward and please help somebody else be as effective as these guys were in their learnings. So thanks for listening, and I look forward to questions.